Okay, so we just learned about servers and started making our backend, and it currently only has one API, which was /API/test, and we want to build more APIs that will be useful to Catbook. So, here we have an example server.js file on our left, and in this example, we can see that they're making their endpoints in the server.js file. So here we have our /dog/test, /dog/breed, /dogs or /cat/test, and /cat/breed API endpoints. Now imagine our server had many more endpoints below. You can imagine that our server.js file will grow so large and be very cluttered and unorganized. So we can ask ourselves a question: is there a clear way to organize our endpoints? And for this example, we can see that we can organize by /dog and by /cat. So currently we have all of our endpoints in our app in our server.js file. And basically what an app is, it just represents our overall server and is our main application. But having all of our endpoints in our server can be cluttered. So this is where the concept of a router comes in. A router is basically an isolated group of API endpoints, and it's basically a mini application. So instead of having all of our endpoints here in the app, we can then instead have our app just use middleware to route any /dog paths to our dog.js file. And in dog.js, we'll have a router and we'll have our /dog endpoints. And then the same thing for cat, we'll have all of our /cat endpoints in cat.js. And so basically, we have two mini applications. So we have our router for our dog and our router for cat. And this makes sure that the code in router and their code in routers, they don't depend on each other, and they are modular and they're independent of code in the server as well. So now we have a much more organized backend, and it's much more easy to navigate. And now we can delve into why we're using routers. Like we said before, for simplicity, so we can declutter our server and organize our endpoints together, and as well as modularity, so we can structure our endpoints in isolation without having to care about logic of server or other routers or other endpoints. So some more additional definitions. So API endpoint is just anything that has a request and response, and it can perform a specific function. So for example, we have our stories endpoint, and then we have our API root, which is the name we can use to access that endpoint. And for our purposes, we're just going to use them interchangeably. So far we only have made a single API endpoint, which is /API/test, and all this returns is a very simple string. While I made my first API, but this doesn't have any dynamic data that we want to have. So maybe we want to display our stories or our comments, or post our stories and post our comments. So we must now make those endpoints. Okay, so now you can pause to input these commands into your terminal, but I'm gonna go ahead in our Catbook folder, git reset dash hard, git fetch, and git checkout w5 dash starter. So now our first step is to move our endpoints from our server to our router. So if you recall, what we start with in this starter code, or like what we ended with from lecture, is having our server.js have our get/API/test endpoint. What we want to end up with is actually having our app be able to route any /API paths to our router from API.js and have our get/API/test endpoint here. So this is the goal of our first step. So to make this happen, what we have to first do is create a separate file, and we have already done that, and it's called api.js. So if you go ahead and look in your server directory, you should see your api.js file, and you can go ahead and open that. So here, server api.js, and you should come to this screen. Our next step is to define a router for /API in api.js. So in api.js, we now want a router. So how can we do that? If we open api.js, we see that there are two to-dos. The first to-do is to add a router. And how can we do this? So we can add a router by const router equals and use just express.router, and this will create a router object provided by express. And then our second to do is to export our router. So we can just use our module.exports equal router. And what this does is it allows other files in our backend to access our router by importing it. Nice. So now our api.js folder has a router, and also we can allow server.js to access it. And if you're ever confused about how you knew to use express.router or how to use module.exports, you can always look up the documentation on Express or documentation on Node. And you can also, of course, ask staff or come to office hours. So our next third step is to define middleware to route any API paths prefixed with /API to API.js. So what this means is we want to have, currently we have our server and we have our router. But what we want is to be able to connect these two files and have any paths that are /API have /API pre-appended to it to be able to be routed to our router in api.js. So we can do that by first going in server.js. To do 3, we can import the router from our API file by using our require keyword to import. So we can set const API equals require and then give it our file name. And what essentially it does is it imports the router that we exported in this file. And then the next step is then to use our middleware and define and tell it any path that has /API, we're going to be using this API router that we got from our api.js file. So now I'm going to go ahead and code this. So we can go to our server.js, and here we can define our API, and then we can import it using our require /API.js. And then here in to-do 4, we're going to use our middleware .use, and then any path that has /API, we are going to use our, we're going to call our API router. So you can see that our routing middleware is actually after another middleware. So what this middleware does is basically it parses any JSONs that come to the backend into strings that we can understand. And the reason this is important is because when data comes from our request, sometimes it's in the form of JSON, but we want to access that data. So we must have this before our routing because order matters. In the order we define our middleware matters And so if it's below, then we might not be able to have our JSONs parsed before we go into our API.js folder file. So now we have connected our routes. Our next step is to move our current /API/test endpoint from our server into our API.js file. So how can we do that? So here we see that in server.js, we currently have this to-do 5, and we have our endpoint here. We want to get rid of it there and move it over into our API.js file. And you can see that there are two main changes we want to make when we move it in. First, instead of using app, we're going to be using router. And instead of using /API/test, we're going to just use /test as the address here. And the reason is if you recall, we used app.use/API, API. And what this does is because we know that it will be prefixed with /API, when we refer to it here, we no longer should include that /API anymore. So now we're going to go ahead and do to-do 5. Going to cut out our endpoint and paste it right here. And then make those two changes, router and /test. And feel free to pause anytime in the video. But now we have moved our endpoints from our app, but now it's all in our router. And we use our middleware to route our paths from the server to our router in API.js. So just going to add another line. So when we run it, we can tell that it has been run in our API.js file. So to run it, you can use npm start and then go to localhost 3000 /API/test. So npm start. And then now we can go to localhost 3000 /API/test. And look, we can see our message that has now been made from a separate file using routers. Awesome. Oh. So now we can get reset --hard and get fetch, and then check out w5-step1. So get reset --hard, fetch, check out w5-step1. Okay. So our next step is to define get routes so that our front end can now fetch our data and display our stories and comments. So first of all, how are we going to store our data? So currently, we haven't learned about databases yet. So we have just, for now, hard-coded just a data object in API.js, and it will contain our stories in data.stories. And for each story object, we can see there's a unique identifying ID, which is a number, creator name, and content. And then we also have an array of comments in data.comments, and we can see we have a unique identifying number, creator name, and then we see content, but also we see this extra field called parent. And this parent is also just a number. So what this parent basically is just the parent ID. So it is the ID of the story that it is a comment under. And so here its parent is 0. So the story that this is a comment under is this story with this ID of 0. So Tony said send it or blend it, and Stanley basically replied both. So our first to do is to add a story to data.stories. So here you can see right here we can add a to do. So feel free to pause and add your own story, but I'm gonna go ahead and give our data.stories a new story object. Okay, so now we have our new story object. So our next to do is to make our API endpoint for getting stories. So if you recall, a get root has we give it the HTTP function, so whether it be get or post, and then it has the path, so the endpoint path, and then it has our callback function. So the callback function has a parameter of request and response. And so request is how we get access incoming data from our client, and our response is how we send data from our backend to our client. And then we can send it using res.send as a function. So once again, request is the incoming request from client, and we can access the data using these different keywords. And then response is our server response, and we can set the status with an HTTP code of such as 200 or 500, and then we can send an object back to the front end. So our first to do is to make our get endpoint for /API/stories. And so we can ask ourselves two main questions. The first question being, what does the root need to do? And our root needs to send back all the stories to the front end. And then our second question is, how can we access all the stories? And we can use data.stories. So whenever you make a new endpoint or plan out your API, you should ask at least these two questions. So here's the solution. We can add our endpoint again using router.get, and then give it our path, which is /stories. And remember, we don't need to include API/stories because our middleware already handles that matching of /API. And then in our callback function, all we need to do is send all the stories back, so we can access it using data.stories. So feel free to pause here and copy down, but I'm going to go ahead and in step 2, I'm going to define router.get /stories request response, and I'm going to send data.stories. So now we can test it out. So in one terminal, we can run our backend server by running npm start. And in another terminal, we can run our front-end server by running npm run hot loader. Okay, so I already had npm start running here, but you can just, I'll run it again so you can see npm start. And so now if I go to localhost 3000 /API/stories. Remember, this is our backend server on port 3000. We can see our stories array. And then if we go to localhost 5050, which is our front-end server, we can see there are errors because our front end is trying to make GET requests to endpoints that don't exist yet. We haven't made our API/comment endpoint yet, but we can just ignore that, and we can see so far that our front end can now display our stories. For now, it doesn't have the comment because we would expect Stanley's comment under here. So we can go ahead and do that now by making our getComments endpoint. So if you recall, our HTTP request is made up of many parts, and one such part is the URL that includes the root and query. So the URL, the query actually includes the data that is sent from our front end to our back end for GET requests, and this is just by convention. So you can use rec.query to access information being sent from the front end to our back end and for GET requests. And an example of how this can be done is, for example, this is a GET request in the front end. So the front end will say, get me whatever is at /API/weblab, and here is a query. And then in the query, we see this content called web development class and competition. And then in the backend, we can see at the /weblet endpoint, we can access the content that was passed in the GET request by using rec.query.content. And it will give us web development class and competition. Another way we can have the rec.query data be passed in is by if you go to the URL and then at the path defined of API/weblab with the question mark, which is the query operator, we can define content and set it equal to web development class and competition. And again, in the backend, we just access it using rec.query.content. So using this information on rec.query, we can now go and look into how our GET request is made in the front end for when they request comments. So if you go to car.js in client and then source components modules car.js, we can see right here in our use effect, we have our get function. And our get function, it says at this endpoint /API/comment, get me the comments for this parent. And remember, parent is just the ID number of a story. And so basically it's saying, get me all the comments that have, get me all the comments that are under this story ID. And then they have a then function. So whatever you return, I am going to set comments. So this tells us that it expects at this endpoint, they want the comments under this story, and then they want us to return those comments so that they can set it. So using this information, how can we access whatever is passed in their query from the backend? We can use rec.query.parent. So now we're going to make now it's your turn to define get/API/comment. And you can first have to figure out what story you need the comments from. And remember, we just learned rec.query.parent. And then we can filter out the comments that are the children of that story and then send those comments back to the front end. So here are some hints. First, it's just like API/stories, but with some more logic. Second hint is you can use the array.filter function from JavaScript. And then the last hint is that rec.query returns a string. So you want to use double equals to compare values of different data types. So feel free to pause the video here, but I'm going to go ahead and continue the solution. So first, what does this root need to do? We need to figure out what story we need the comments from, and we got it from rec.query.parent. And then we can filter our data comments object to find the matches, and then we can just use res.send to send our comments back. So here is how we can filter our comments. We can use data.comments and then apply the filter function. And for every comment in data.comments, we're going to check if its parent matches the rec.query parent. And note we use double equals instead of triple equals because rec.query returns the type string, and then comment.parent is an int. And so to compare these two, we need to use double equals. And so here is the final solution. So we define our get method and we give it the path, and then we filter our comments, and then we send it back. So feel free to pause here to copy, but I'm going to go ahead and implement this right here in our 223. So instead of copying previous code, we recommend typing it out yourself just to practice making an endpoint. Okay, so first we can define filtered comments, and we can filter on data.comments. For every comment, we're going to check if comment got parent. And if you remember, in data.comments, each item has an object called parent, which identifies the story, and it's typed in. So we're just getting that exactly this value in data.comments. And then we're going to set it and check it if it's equal to rec.query.parent. Okay, so now we have all our comments that are filtered. We can just send it back. We can send our filtered comments back to the front ends so that they can display it. So once again, we can go to our localhost 3000, and now we can go to API/comment, and we have to give it a query object of parent, and we can give it 0. And try to pause here and predict what you expect to see. If you recall, we have comments here and one comment here, and its parent is 0. So go ahead and predict, but now I'm just gonna go ahead and we're gonna see exactly the comment that has a parent of 0. So now what if we went and gave it a parent of 1? What do we expect? We expect nothing because there is no comments with a parent of 1 currently. So now again, if we go to our front end and refresh, we expect to see our comments displayed, and we do. Nice. So now we see our stories and our comments, and we can even expect to see what is happening. So in our network, if we refresh, we can see, oh, we're getting our get requests for stories, and we're getting our comments. So it's pretty cool. Now we can reset and then check out step 2. So go ahead and pause and do these commands. I'm going to go ahead and reset. Okay, so now we're going to go back and try to make a new story. Once you made a new story, you can inspect what is outputted in console and not network when you make a new story or comment. So I'm going to go ahead and write hi. And we see that there's an error. And so there's an error with 404 not found, and that's because we haven't defined our /API/story endpoint yet. But maybe we want some more useful information, and maybe we want our server, for example, to like log every time that there is a 404 not found, or anytime there's an error. So what we can do is make another API endpoint, and what it does is handle any missing routes, and we can make console log statements, or we can do different things with this information. So basically, yes, Express already has existing error handling code that displays 404 not found, but if we wanted to have our own, we can write our extra endpoint to handle and give us additional information or additional print or log statements. So we're going to go ahead and do this for 2-1, and we're going to remember that we should put it all the way below any other API routes, or else it will match all the API routes, and all the API routes, even if it's a valid endpoint, will just go here if it's written before it. So that's why we have our endpoint to handle missing routes right here at the bottom. And so we can define it as router.all. And so what all does is includes all requests, HTTP request types. So like both get and post endpoints will go here. And then we give a star, which means it'll match any number of any character. And then we can go ahead and give it our request response. And then we can console.log and use our backtick, which is on the left upper corner of our keyboard. API route not found. Rect.method. Rect.url. And then we can set our status. Send. And we can send a message. API route not found. And so now, before we had console log statements in the front end, but now we can have console logs. Now we're writing our console log statement in our back end. So what this means is we can expect our print statement or console log statement to be displayed here in our server. There seems to be an error. So all star. Oh, this should be a comma. Okay. So now what we expect is when we go here to, and when we try to post while it's not defined, yes, we still have our 404 not found, but here we also now see that our server is logging as well that we have an error. So now our backend server can also be aware of any attempts to go to routes that are not found, and maybe it can be useful, for example, if you want to know if someone is trying to access a route not found many times, or maybe some malicious activity might be happening, having these log statements could potentially be useful. So that is one use of having a endpoint here to catch anything that is missing. So now that we have our endpoint defined, we can now make our post routes. So now we want our front end to be able to send data to our backend, and our backend to be able to update our data object to store whatever information they gave us. So if you recall, HTTP requests have many different parts, and the part that we can get the information sent from our front end to our back end for post requests is actually different from get requests, and we use rec.body, and this is mainly by convention. So for rec.body, we can see again, they can pass it through on the front end, they can pass it through their post request, and then in the back end, we can just use it using rec.body dot whatever values defined here. So now our second to do is to post stories. So again, we need to figure out what needs to be saved, and then we have to put it into a story structure, and then we need to add it to our data object. And to know what we need to put into our story structure, we can see what a new story needs in terms of its fields from data.stories. You can see it needs ID, creator name, and content. And then another hint is to remember what is sent from the front end. So in the front end, if you go to new post input.js, you can see this code where they call their post function, and their post function, they pass in this body, and this body has this value called content. And essentially this content is the same as the content that would be displayed in a story. So hopefully that gives a hint on how on the value or where you can get the content being posted from the front end to the back end. Another hint is that here in the front end, you can see that they expect to get a story object so that they can add it to display. So hopefully this gives you a hint on what you should be sending back from the back end to the front end. So go ahead and pause here and attempt. But I'm gonna go ahead and so I'm gonna go over first the story object that we make. We can use data.stories.length as a unique ID because we're not deleting anything. So since we're only adding, we can expect that it will be a unique number. And then for creator name, you can give any string you want to have it displayed. We have a variable actually right above data that you can also change. It currently is set to anonymous, but you can give your own creator name. And then you can also give the content that is being passed from the front end by using rec.body.content. And again, we use rec.body for post requests to get the data from post requests. And then here's the full solution. So we have our post, and then we give the path, which is a /story, and then in our callback function, we define our new story. We push it to our data.stories, and then we can send it to our friend. So you can feel free to pause right here, but I'm gonna go ahead and code. So router.post, and then /story, and then request response. And then we can define the story and give an ID, and can be data.stories.length. And then we can give it the content creator name, and we can use my name, and then we can use content, and content will be passed from the front end, so rec.body.content. And now we have our new story object, and we can now push it to our data.stories. Push. We can push our new story, and then recall that in new post input server.js are the post requests. They expect that we send back our new story object so that they can display it on the front end. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and change my name from anonymous to Vista. And then I'm gonna go ahead. We're gonna go ahead and test adding a new story. So we can go ahead and go to the front end once again. And now we expect that we can post new stories. I'm gonna say hello. And voila, we see exactly the creator name that we gave, and then we see that we can give our own content and have it be displayed. Okay, so now continuing on, the next to do is to write post comments, and so you can now go ahead and attempt, but before so we can give some hints. So we want to add an API route that handles post requests to /API/comment. First hint is a lot like post/API/story. Second hint is you can know what a new comment needs from data.comments, and data.comments needs an ID, creator name, and it requires a parent ID of the story is a comment under, and then the content. And then you can see what is being sent from the front end here. We can see that there is a parent field and a content field being passed in to our post requests to /API/comment, and that it expects to receive the new comment object so that it can display the comment on the screen. Go ahead and pause here, but I'm going to continue on to the solution. So now we can go here and we can add our post comment endpoint. So again, we can do router.post/comment, and we can give it our function request response, and then can define a new comment object, and then we can give ID comments.length, creator name, which we can again do my name, content. Oh, we expect parent, which is passed from rec.body.parent, and content, which we expect also to be passed in from the front end into rec.body.content. And then we can push our new comment to our backend data object, and then we can send our new comment object back to the front end for displaying. So now we should we can see the solution here, and feel free to pause here and copy it down. But now we're going to do one last test. And if we go again to our front end, we should be able to see our comment. First place. And then also we can make new stories. Hello, hello. Awesome. So now our front end is fully connected to our back end and being able to get and also send data. So that's pretty awesome. So we can successfully comment and also see. Okay, so we can successfully comment, and if you have a bug, feel free to check out the full solution at W5 Complete and play around and look at the code. So one thing you may have noticed is that when we changed our server.js file. So after we made our post endpoint, we made a story. And then when we refreshed it after we changed the comments, our stories disappeared. So what this means is that our data object is just defined in our file. So it lasts only as long as the server stays running. So if the server reloads or the server is crashes and has to be remade, restarted, then this means all of our objects, all of our data that we stored to our data object will disappear. So we can go ahead and demonstrate it. So here we have our stories. So if we restart our server by killing it and then starting it, if we refresh, all of our stories disappeared. So how can we solve that? We can solve it with something called databases, and we will be learning that tomorrow. So be sure to set up your MongoDB Atlas before tomorrow's workshop. And here were the announcements for Thursday. And remember, milestone 1 pitch, project pitch signups are due Friday at midnight. And please give us feedback because we are trying to incorporate it. And we know that it's quite hard, but we're looking for ways to improve it. And please let us know. And then if you have other thoughts, feel free to fill it out at Milk and Cookies. And that's it for today.